Thanks for joining me in another video about the early game of Skyrim Requiem. The content here is from Treva's watch in the Rift. Basically, I was wandering around. I realized I needed to get a few more levels and some more loot. The enemies here are pretty manageable, so I thought I'd just go and raid a few forts. Normally, I think you do this castle in the Companion's Quest. Since I'm not doing any factions, I pretty much have to find my own content when I want to level. So right now I'm level 7. I'll be honest, this is pretty rough footage. I get killed a couple of times. If that puts you off, then this might not be the video for you. But to distract from my poor gameplay performance, I'll be talking about a more high-level concept which might be helpful to people who are either new to Requiem or thinking about how they want to do their builds, and that is talking about different types of offense and different types of defense. So Skyrim is, at the end of the day, a combat-centered game, so destroy your enemies before they can kill you, and how you go about doing that will affect your gameplay experience more than most anything else. So thinking about how you want to arrange your offense and arrange your defense as you think about your character build is pretty important. Otherwise, you may find yourself in a spot where you just can't keep advancing, and it's pretty frustrating if you get to a place in the game where you'd like to be able to keep doing higher level content, but because of your build, you're unable to do that. And usually those problems come because of an inadequate focus on the types of offense and the types of defense that you want to have. So let's start by talking about offense. I'll break it down into 3 different ways you can do offensive damage. And a lot of these ideas, they came from a Reddit post that was written years and years ago, which I can't find it anymore, so I'm hoping sharing it through this format will keep those ideas around because I personally found it really helpful. Anyway, the 3 types of offensive damage that you can do are sustained damage, burst damage, or crowd control damage. Obviously, these aren't categories designed by the game. I'm just arbitrarily using those terms in order to have some kind of placeholder that we can talk about. So, first of all, sustained damage. Here, the idea is to have either damage over time or a frequent sequence of small hits which bleed down an enemy's hit points. So, best example is the Bleak Falls Barrow episode that I did very recently, where I just chip away at enemies. Draugr don't regenerate, they don't have health potions, so as long as they're taking damage and as long as they're not doing me damage, then I'm eventually winning that fight. The problem with sustained damage is many of the mid to high level enemies in Requiem have a lot of health regeneration, like trolls, spriggans. Others have really high armor levels, like dragon priests once they get their mage armor up, and it's just very hard to actually kill them if you're relying on frequent small hits of damage. So that brings us to our second type, which is burst damage. The idea being to have a very large hit which knocks an enemy out of the fight before they have a chance to really respond. In my old series that I did 5 years ago, there's an episode on Dragon Priest where I'm one-shotting them with a 2-handed weapon before they can get their shields up. That is burst damage. And for this particular character I'm playing right now, the burst damage is coming from the crossbow, which against light enemies can take them out of the fight really quickly. Arrows in general against light enemies have high burst damage, or fired at you, they have high burst damage, and can cause you to get one-shotted yourself. That's the nature of the game. But also, if you have a lot of perks in 2-handed, 1-handed, I'm hoping, or in destruction magic, all of those can give you a big source of burst damage to take care of enemies quickly. Finally is crowd control, and ideally you would avoid having yourself be largely outnumbered, but it's just the nature of the game that sometimes enemies are aggroed more quickly than you would want them to be, so you need some way to recover from that. One way of doing crowd control is with minions as a distraction, so that all the enemies aren't focusing on you. Another way is with shouts. That's something I'm hoping to explore more with this character over time. And this is kind of your get out of jail free card, so that if you've bit off more than you can chew, you have some way to recover from the situation. But the long and short of it is, you're not going to be able to kill bosses in Requiem, at least at the high level content, unless you have some serious burst damage, or you're so tanky yourself that you can live through a longer and more sustained fight. So let's talk about defenses next a little bit, because, well, Requiem is somewhat infamous for its quote-unquote difficulty, But really, it's not so much that the game is hard, but that it asks you to do some sort of preparation if you don't want yourself to be squishy or vulnerable to particular types of damage. So there's, again, I'll break it down into 3 different types of defenses that you can have. 2 of them in the game and 1 of them is more conceptual. I'll start with the conceptual one, which is mobility. Mobility is a fantastic defense, and it's what I've been focusing on with the character I'm playing now, where if you don't get in the way of the damage, you're not taking any of it. There's none of it even to reduce. In theory, you can use the dodge perk within the evasion tree. I'm not a huge fan of that personally because I find it kind of clunky to use, and I think it's easier to just manually dodge, especially if you're playing as Khajiit, which have the 15% increased bonus to their speed. But even with other characters, if you're really good with your footwork and you're able to avoid most of the hits or position yourself well so that you can get behind cover, then mobility is a huge asset, and it's something that unfortunately you give up if you start going in toward heavy armor, which is how you would get more traditional sorts of defense. So the other 2 types of defense that are officially in the game statistics, there's armor rating and then there's magic resistance, which also has kind of the subset of elemental resistance. The interaction between magic resist and elemental resist is a little bit complicated and beyond the scope of this video, so I'm not going to talk about that right now. But for now, let's just think of elemental resist and magic resist as the same thing. So with the 3.0 update, armor has gotten a pretty big overhaul within Requiem, and again, I don't want to dig into the technical specifications, but different types of attacks have different types of armor that resist them. So whether it's ranged or blunt or slash or what have you, armor can resist those in different amounts. But without diving into the technical part, the part that matters to you is having higher armor resist means you can take more hits and are less likely to be one-shotted by arrows, as well, we've all had that painful experience when playing Requiem, perhaps several times. So that's pretty straightforward. The second part is magic resistance, magic or elemental resistance, because a lot of the most deadly attacks in Requiem will not really be concerned with your armor. They are trying to kill you with various spells, and that's why mages are really tough early on. And this is kind of where the Requiem circle of life, or the rock, paper, scissors comes from, which is that light armored characters are better against mages because they have the ability to dodge spells. And by light armored, I usually mean ranged characters with arrows because they can fire back at the mages or try and snipe them. But light armored characters have a hard time dealing with heavy armor because they have high armor resistance and it prevents arrows from doing very much damage. And then finally, heavy armored characters have a hard time with mages because they have a difficulty in closing the distance and putting pressure on the mage, so they just get blown up from afar. So where does this all come together when you're thinking about how your character is going to work? Well, first of all, think about where you are on the rock, paper, scissors aspect and try to break the circle a little bit. So if, for example, you were doing a heavy armored character, you know you're going to be a little bit more vulnerable to mages, so you probably want to have some kind of long distance burst damage, like a crossbow, that you can try and use to snipe them off. It may be worth investing a little bit to make your crossbow more effective than it would otherwise be. If you're playing a light armored character, like I am, well, I know I'm more vulnerable in crowd control situations because most of my damage is sustained. It takes a while for me to kill each enemy. It takes a couple of hits. So I'm hoping to augment my crowd control abilities by focusing pretty heavily on shouts. I may take some of those in the perk tree. I've never tried that before, using the perks toward buffing your shouts, but I'm hoping it'll be a winner for this particular character. And while in theory I should be stronger against mages, I'm going to be focusing pretty heavily on getting my magic resist and a little bit more armor, but not too much, because I'm not all that worried about opposing archers once my health gets a little bit higher, but mages continue to be a big problem for me. Finally, if you're playing as a mage, you want to be thinking about how you're going to deal with archers, because those are going to be the biggest problem for you, because you're going to be pretty high level before you can have a heavy armored mage. It's just very hard to get all the necessary perks and skills to make that happen. So you'll be running around in robes a lot. Well, how do you deal with archers? You need to have some kind of a distraction. So even just having a ghostly warhound, the apprentice level conjuration spell, is really great for any character that's worried about archers because it works as a distraction and also helps you a little bit with crowd control. But mages don't have to be all that worried about heavy armored characters, so there's not a whole lot of need for a mage to worry about armor piercing, but it might still be a good idea to carry around a crossbow as a mage in case you get into a duel and want to end it quickly. So that's about all I have to say about offense and defense within Requiem, and really this is intended as a guide so that you can put your character in a direction where you'll be able to handle all the content you run into and not have something that stonewalls all your progress and keeps you from moving forward. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next one.